All right. Just by raise of hands, with historical buildings, do any of you have any of your county buildings that are listed on the National Historical Register?
Tore them down.
Tore them down. Just kidding, I'm working on it. You still have the plaque though, right? So a few of you have. Do you have other buildings that maybe house county employees that are over 70, 80 years old, in addition to the National Historical Register properties?
All of them.
All of them. Okay.
Well, we tore down the historical one before though.
So what our main purpose with this presentation is, you know, a lot of times I think a very frustrating thing can be, and maybe it's happened to you on maybe with your homeowner's insurance or car insurance or what have you, if you feel like you have certain coverage and then a loss happens and you find out that you don't have the coverage that you assumed you had. And so we want to address kind of the different coverage options and some of the specific things that go into having a historical building as far as rebuild. And so we'll go into, so this is the Beaver County Courthouse. It's now a museum. It's a beautiful building. When was it built, Commissioner Dalton? I think
Long before my time. That's a long time ago.
seemed like 1896, if I remember right.
Well,
And so,
John D. Lee trial was held there, so that's been a long time.
really? Okay. Okay. So we'll just jump on this next building. This is the Box Elder County Courthouse. And just a quick definition of a historical building. Of course, age, construction methods, design, and architectural features are really the main component of a historic building. But also significance with respect to a historical event. The John Lee trial, that's certainly a historical event in the state of Utah. And so, you know, back then, we were just talking about it with some of these buildings, they have plaster, and the plaster has horsehair that's built into it to kind of grab and to give it a little more texture. So there's just the construction methods 100 years ago are clearly much different than your mud and tape that you get at Home Depot. And so, so we'll go into some of those construction methods and how it can be difficult to replicate some of those. And so, and then the insurance angle on that as well. And so, let's see here. So, if you're curious, if you're not aware of any buildings that you have on the register and you'd like to check, these are links. I believe that we'll upload the electronic copy of this too. I know you can type in the email or the website address there, but if you click on those, they have some searches on both the state site and the national site where you can find any building in your county that's on the register. And so the one main qualification, it has to be at least 50 years old. Weber County has a library, I think the Roy Library, that is currently in application status. It's kind of an Art Deco building and it has some significance in Weber County, and so they have an application in to have it placed on the register. So let's see here. So if we jump over here, these are kind of your basic building coverage options. Actual cash value, replacement cost minus depreciation at the time of loss. So if you have a $100,000 structure that's maybe 30 or 40 years old, you know, there's going to be some depreciation, so you know maybe it's $30,000 or $40,000 less. So actual cash value would be, if you have a $100,000 structure that's 30 years old, you're going to get $60,000, $70,000 for it, or whatever the depreciation amount is. Replacement cost, which is probably the most standard, especially for a building. It's the cost to replace a property with similar size and functionality, and it's built with modern construction materials and by modern standards. The next one, and that's where you get into your historic properties, and not just historic properties, it's also unique properties. You may have, I'll show you some pictures of some very unique buildings that probably would require reproduction cost rather than replacement cost, and they're newer buildings. So reproduction cost is the cost to duplicate a building by using materials, artistry, and other expertise that are comparable to what was used in the original structure. So the horsehair plaster, you know, maybe the 10 to 12 inch thick granite or stone. So some of those that were used in the original structure. So that's just kind of a breakdown of your coverage options. Actual cash value, we don't really see, you know, very many properties on your schedules, your property schedules with that.
Really where actual cash comes into play is that the coverage agreement says if you don't rebuild that building within 2 years, you're going to get actual cash value. So it's really any buildings that you're utilizing, but if it burned to the ground, you wouldn't rebuild it. Then tell us that you want actual cash value and you'll pay less for the coverage, because that's all you're going to get, because you're not going to rebuild it.
A rebuild of 100,000, but you don't want to rebuild it. Maybe it's worth 50,000 to you. Just put 50,000 coverage on it, actual cash value, and so. Okay, so if we jump in, one thing I want to emphasize is the difference between replacement cost and reproduction cost. As you could imagine, reproduction cost is much more expensive to rebuild in most cases than replacement cost. Just because you're trying to replicate something that perhaps a lot of contractors just quite frankly don't know how to reconstruct that. And not only that, it takes a lot more time and effort and resources to try to bring it back to its original condition. So one thing, in order to cover a property at reproduction cost, with some of those structures that are listed on the register, when we send HCA, which is the appraisal firm that we use, when we send them out, if they identify a property that's on the register, they're going to give us two values. The first value, they're going to give us replacement cost. And then the second value, they're going to give us a reproduction cost with the property. In a lot of cases, you know, with, for instance, some of the courthouses, there's probably a $2 to $3 million swing in replacement cost to reproduction cost. So it certainly translates into more. You're going to pay more for the insurance coverage on that as well. And so, let's see. I don't know if there's a handout that's included in there. It has pictures of these structures. But that will give you some real life scenarios of, you know, for instance, this building on the top here has, I think, 8-inch walls. And I don't remember where this is located, but it's in the United States. Under replacement cost, that building, they're not going to build it with 8-inch or 8 to 10-inch thick walls. They're going to build it, just frame it, and then they're going to put a veneer on it. Under replacement cost. Under reproduction cost, they're going to try to replicate that and build it exactly how it is. And so in that handout, it should give you a few scenarios with that. And so let's see. So these buildings are just amazing to me. This one is actually a real building. It's the company that is housed in that building makes maple baskets, and so they decided to make their building a maple basket too. And so, so these are some that, you know, replacement cost coverage. They're very unique. Replacement cost coverage, you know, may not cut it if they want that same structure built. And so. Now, the question is, can you have reproduction cost on any property that's not historic and a property that's not listed on the register? And the answer is yes. These, if one of these were a county building and you were concerned about getting that right exactly the way it was built, we can add reproduction cost onto that structure. And so let's see. So this brings up a point. That there's somewhat of a myth in the insurance industry that says if your structure is on the historic register, that you are required by federal law to rebuild it exactly the way it was. And that's a myth that's very common in the insurance industry. The answer to that is you actually don't have to rebuild it to reproduction cost. Having it listed on the register is really mainly just honorary. There are some economic benefits to having a property on the register, but realistically the federal or the state government for that matter, they're not interested in mandating or requiring you to rebuild certain things. Certainly they would love it if there was a total loss, that you try to preserve some of those things as you're rebuilding, and they encourage that, but there's no federal or state law requiring that. This situation I thought was interesting because there is one exception to that rule. On the local level, whether it's city or county, you may have a statute or an ordinance or a building code that says, you know what, if you have a historic property, you're going to rebuild it to reproduction cost. And so if you have some of these structures, you will want to check with your city and your county ordinances to make sure that there's nothing in place that will require you to rebuild that property. Park City, for instance, from my understanding, on Main Street, there are some ordinances that will require them, especially on Main Street, to at least rebuild the property with the same facade. Because they want it uniform and they want it to kind of preserve that historic feel to it. So I think back in the 60s or 70s, I actually have an uncle who was going to do a BLM lease in Fish Lake, just in Sevier County. And one of the requirements with that land lease is you had to build the cabin with surrounding materials. So in this case, if you go to Fish Lake, a lot of the cabins are built with lava rock because that's found, and just in the area. And so reproduction cost could come into play with that, where the BLM is requiring you to rebuild this property with lava rock. Lava rock is probably more expensive than stucco. Insurance companies generally will rebuild with, modern standards. Lava rock isn't necessarily that, so there could be coverage, issues if you're rebuilding. So with this one, this is in San Francisco, and this just happened recently. This is within the last year. Let me go here. So this is the Largent house. It was built by an architect named Richard Neutra in 1936. Within the last 2 years, there was a buyer that came along. He paid $1.7 million for the property. Property is not listed on the National Historic Register. And he decides to kind of to crack that can open with his contractor, and they start to tear walls out and to tear things. And they decide that they didn't feel like it was structurally sound enough to do a renovation, so they decided just to demo it. The Planning Commission in San Francisco, as you can imagine, they were not big fans of them demoing the house, and so they decided. Just let you read that. They did this contractor, this individual, his plan was to build a 4,000 square foot home on this property, and so the Planning Commission came back and said, you illegally demoed the building, and we're not a fan of that. Besides, this is a very well-known architect. We want to preserve his work. And Richard Neutra is gone. In fact, his son still works for the firm, and his son is 92 years old. And so, so this was, this is quite some time ago. And so they ordered this owner of the property to build it with the footprint, massing, method, and materials of the original house. So this is a case where wasn't on the National Historic Register. So by federal or state law, they're not mandated at all to rebuild. However, the local jurisdiction said, no, we want to preserve that, so you're going to rebuild it exactly the way that it was. And so, again, that just kind of drives home the point of if you do have, some of these properties that are historic in nature, that you'll want to check with the local ordinances, because there are a few in Utah that do require a rebuild, at least partially. So that's an interesting article. There's the link there if you'd like to read that. And then just going back to this, just the building ordinance and codes for rebuild requirements. Check with local cities. There is another exception too, and I should probably back up a little bit. If you are rebuilding a property, if there are federal dollars involved with the rebuild of that property, they may require that you rebuild it to reproduction cost as well. They may want it brought back to kind of its original state if there's federal dollars involved. And so there are a few little exceptions, within this. And so, okay. So let's see here. So to close, I'm going to let Doug get an early jump on his presentation. This is just a checklist. If you're concerned about any of the properties, as it sits right now, there are very few properties that are reproduction cost out of all of the buildings covered by USIP. And so if you're concerned about that, you have the choice, of course. If you have a property that that perhaps local sentiment, if the community, if something happened, if there was a total loss, where the community would want to rebuild that exactly the way it was, you may want to consider a reproduction cost. Some other factors could be tourism. If there's a property that brings some economic benefits to the county, and that you want to preserve that, reproduction cost is another consideration with that. And so this is just a checklist on first, of course, you identify it. If you need me to run any reports, I'm happy to run reports on, say, any buildings in your county over 70 years old, and then we can take a look at them and see. So if that's the case, we'd run that report, and then we determine the objective. There's some situations where it's a beautiful building, we love it, but we're okay with replacement cost because it does, it does cost more money to cover, because it's just, there's a lot more involved in the rebuild. And so, so after, if you do decide you want to move forward with reproduction cost on the property, we will actually send out that appraiser, and he or she will do a reproduction cost value, and then we can go from there and add it to the schedules as reproduction cost. We let our reinsurance company know that it's covered under reproduction cost as well, so they're in the loop. And then, at that point, you've got coverage for that. And so, if you're not sure if you've got questions, my contact information is here as well. And so, but that's all that I have. Are there any questions about properties at all, or any questions? Okay. Well, again, feel free to call me if you do have questions, and like I said, I'm happy to run the report if you want to check into some of the properties within your county. So that's all I have.